by Emily Carr. Well, the names of the short stories I'm referring to, they are all geographical names, and they are situated on this northwest coast of Canada, and more or less around the Queen Charlotte Islands, just to have an idea. Well, in the spring of 1913, Canadian artist Emily Carr gave her first public talk in Vancouver. The title of this lecture was Lecture on Totems, and it served as an introduction to an exhibition of more than 200 paintings with a native subject matter. This comprehensive pictorial work was the result of several trips to First Nations regions, which had begun in 1898, as well as several stays in San Francisco, England and France, aimed at acquiring and extending her artistic education. In this paper, I propose to elaborate on the link between writing and painting by looking particularly into 3 stories from Clearwig, in parallel with a few instances of Carr's pictorial work. This may help to reveal some distinctive features of Emily Carr's creative process. Clearwig, first published in 1941, is a collection of 21 stories that recount experiences of Emily Carr's life, in particular her trips to the northwest coast of Canada, which created deep impressions conveyed literally in this book, and also these travels found a pictorial expression. Carr's initial intention was to offer a kind of ethnographic testimony of native cultures which, in her opinion, and also her contemporaries' opinion, they thought that these cultures were destined or doomed to disappear. In 1912, Carr made a trip to the villages of Tanu, Skedans, and Kanshida, situated on Queen Charlotte Islands. And 16 years later, in 1928, she planned to travel back to 2 of these places. Her 1912 trip is the subject of her stories Tanu, Skedans, and Kanshida. And her 1928 trip is recollected in Salt Water. The 3 stories and the related paintings reflect and refer to cultural elements of the Haida, like community houses, totem poles or canoes, as well as social customs, rituals, and ceremonies. These Haida villages were already deserted when Emily Carr visited them, so her stories reflect ruin and desolation. But surprisingly, perhaps from our perspective, Carr doesn't seem to weep over a situation that has political and social implications. She rather appears to accept such neglect as if it were parallel to natural decay. In Tanu, the place offers itself to the newcomer as a temple, solemn and still, a place of worship. Quote, "It was so still and solemn on the beach, it would have seemed irreverent to speak aloud. It was as if everything were waiting and holding its breath." End of quote. Carr is careful to point to the fragility of the place as if its holiness depended on silence. This image may be related to her concerns about nature as the real place of worship. This theme is also a leitmotif in her journals. For instance, on 11 October 1935, she notes in her diary, "It is God in his woods tabernacle I long to express." On the other hand, Tanu includes a significant amount of dialogue, which appears to disrupt the atmosphere of the place. The narrator feels as if a serious harm has been inflicted, and at the end of the story, she must perforce restore the place to its original stillness. Quote, then we went away from Tanu and left the silence to heal itself. End of quote. The narration focuses on the creation of an atmosphere and on the anecdote of its characters, the natives Jimmy and Louisa, the missionary's daughter, and the narrator. Under the eerie atmosphere of the place lie the memories of its people and the material elements of their culture. The inventory of this story includes the skeleton of a house with beams, corner posts, and 2 carved poles, one at each end. Lots of totem poles, one of them depicting the myth of the flood, and in a different part of the village, 3 house fronts with a tall totem pole each. Quote, on the base of the pole was the figure of a man. He had on a tall hat, which was made up of sections, and was a hat of great honor. On the top of the hat perched a raven. Little figures of men were clinging to every ring of honor, all the way up the hat. End of quote. The tall totem poles that stand up in the center of 3 fine house fronts, all that remains from what probably were community houses, are house frontal poles depicted an eagle and 2 beavers. We'll see them later. They quote, beyond the little point there were 3 fine house fronts. A tall totem pole stood up against each house in the center of its front. When Jimmy cut away the growth around the foot of them, the paint on the poles was quite bright. The lowest figure of the center pole was a great eagle. The other 2 were beavers with immense teeth. They held sticks in their hands. End of quote. Emily Carr made this trip to Tanu in the summer of 1912, about a year after her return from France, where she had spent almost a year. We know from her story that she devoted her time on the island to painting. As an example of the pictorial work related to this trip, we may refer to Tanu. That's an oil on canvas dated 1913. The oil highlights the interest in depicting the exuberance of nature's colors in contrast with a more mature stage where Emily Carr will emphasize form and rhythm. There is a decorative placement of the elements in the painting as if the art still depended on superficial vision rather than underlying feeling. The totem poles depicted are mainly informative elements of ethnographic character, but the painting also shows concern about the artistic expression. It is the inner conflict of Carr's pictorial interest that makes this painting so interesting. On the one hand, there is Carr's intention to represent native life in a faithful way. On the other hand, the painting bears witness to her struggle to find an artistic expression that makes her abandon purely realistic patterns of representation. The period when these native stories were written coincides with Emily Carr's stay in hospital in January 1937. That is when, in face of the limitations that her poor health imposes on her painting activity, she decides to devote herself to her Indian stories, as she calls them. It is obvious that this particular writing satisfies important drives. In the first place, she's striving to find a definitive and elaborate shape for a writing production that she had begun about 10 years ago, albeit with a different aim. In another piece of writing, she says that it was not handling of paint, but handling of thoughts which overwhelmed me. Trying to get around this problem, I took always in my sketch sack a little notebook. In the second place, the stories attempt to make up for the absence of painting. From this perspective, and considering that for Emily Carr, art and writing were twins, it may be worth looking into what is visual in the story Tanu, and to what extent the story shows artistic maturity compared to the painting of the same name. Several aspects in the story deserve mentioning. To begin with, there is an attempt to describe the feeling that emerges from this place, as if this feeling were the way the object expresses itself, with a language of its own creation. There is a global approach followed by close-ups of individual objects. The integration of elements achieved in the narration contrasts positively with the separation of elements in the pictorial composition. Quote, at one side of the Tanu beach rose a big bluff, black now that the sun was behind it. It is said that the bluff is haunted. At its foot was the skeleton of a house. All that was left of it was the great beams and the corner posts and two carved poles, and each at one end of it. Inside, where the people used to live, was stuffed with elderberry bushes, scrub trees, and firewood. In that part of the village, no other houses were left, but there were lots of totem poles sticking up. End of quote. In the second place, and according to Emily Carr's aesthetic ideal, the work of art must search beyond the surface of objects in order to capture the thought. This is the reason why the writer, after introducing this integral vision, steps back to allow Louisa to tell a story of totems in a loose sort of way, as if she had half forgotten it. It is as if Carr believed that for the natives, only emotional associations and not their cultural representations were deemed essential. She places herself in the native culture in an ambiguous position, and it is this ambiguity that she takes pains to explain throughout her work. She seems to imply that the emotions associated to these artistic representations bind the members of a culture together and legitimate that same culture. This cohesive emotional factor is important in the stories from Gliwick because it defines the position of the people not belonging to the First Nations culture of reference. Emily Carr tends to describe her own presence as an integration or immersion, in contrast to the other non-natives who appear in her stories. In Tanu, Emily depicts herself as fully absorbing all the aspects of a culture that she finds fascinating. Although the narration focuses heavily on the rivalry between the writer and Miss Missionary, as she calls the woman, the other white woman who accompanies her, the influence of this environment is powerful enough to stimulate a sympathetic response and make the narrator come to an understanding of the native culture. Quote, the Indians would not do a thing for Miss Missionary. They let her collect rushes for her own bed and carry things. The mission house in their home village stood on the hill and looked down on the Indians. But here all of us were on the dead level. All of us had the same mosquito-tormented skins and everything in common, and were wholly dependent on the Indians' knowledge and skill. Skedans is the second story that describes Carr's stay in Haida territory. The dominant feeling here is the growth and vitality of nature, to which the narrator attributes a will to grow, as if nature were endowed with the responsibility to develop to its full capacity. Carr identifies the element the elements of this native culture with authenticity in implicit opposition to her own culture. Quote, "The place, an Indian house, was grand. We had got close down to real things. In Skedans there were no shams." We may presume that the conversations she has with the native couple never go beyond the realm of the personal, so Carr is free to mould the natives to her own liking. She believes that their feelings must be very different from the whites, and she's aware that her own curiosity about the native culture may be misconstrued. Although she's not able to elaborate on the nature of the natives' feelings, she's aware of a mystery, of an arcane knowledge she cannot grasp. The hideables were bleached to a pinkish silver color and cracked by the sun, but nothing could make them mean or poor. The Indians had put strong thought into them and had believed sincerely in what they were trying to express. Kansheba is the third and shortest story of the Hyde stories, and it is remarkable for the fine balance of its construction. The persistent rain and the fog the story begins with, enfolded in an atmosphere of unreality, which remains when the protagonist leaves the island. The secret being of the place can only be perceived from within. When the place is left to itself, it remains untouched, as if reluctant to be taken away in the form of memories. Carr translates that impression in the image of a house. It is the only remnant of an earlier habitation, and on its door hangs a lock. In spite of its incongruity, the house stands there as a powerful symbol of all the people that it once sheltered. Some may have been dead or are living in foreign parts. Some perhaps dream of coming back to unlock the door and recover their memories. The narrative point of view deserves mentioning as well. The narrator manages to keep her distance and make as few and discreet interventions as possible. The absence of dialogue contributes to the homogeneity of the narration. There is a single inclusion of spoken speech in perfect English, a better, though imperfect, solution than Carr's customary resource to reproducing the speech of natives in broken English. In this case, this is what she writes: My Indians never said to me, hurry and get this over so that we may go home and be more comfortable. End of quote. In Kunsheva, a young Emily walks around this deserted place where time seems to be in abeyance. The narrator finds some rotten poles covered with moss among the ruins of a house whose dwellers have died of smallpox. The description focuses in the two carved poles, and a few lines manage to transmit an atmosphere of loneliness, absence of human beings, illness and death, without sounding pathetic. A quote: Not far from the house sat a great wooden raven mounted on a rather low pole. His wings were flattened to his sides. A few feet from him stuck up an empty pole. His mate had sat there, but she had rotted away long ago, leaving him moss-grown, dilapidated and alone to watch dead Indian bones. For these two great birds had been set, one on either side of the doorway of a big house that had been full of dead Indians who had died during smallpox epidemic. It appears as if the natives and their totem poles had escaped from the inexorability of death, and their spirit belonged forever to nature. In this atmosphere, a double metamorphosis takes place. One of the totem poles, crowned by a raven, has taken on the appearance of a tree. The human bones and the mud become the fertile soil from where a new vegetal life springs, providing shelter for the old raven, the guardian of the dead. This metamorphosis belongs to a cycle of birth, death, rebirth that Emily Carr ponders about as well in her journals or diaries. Kamsheba from 1912 is a watercolor that depicts a raven akin to the figure describing the story of the same name from Kiwi. It is a youthful composition, and I'm referring to the one above. It is a youthful composition of joyful colors, somewhat clumsy in the design of the low vegetation on the right of the picture. The raven, lacking force and weight, holds himself precariously on the post. He looks rather like a giant wooden toy, and that lack of achievement in the purpose makes him look a little bit incongruous. Looking at the overall watercolor, you find out that what is wrong is that the bird is not properly integrated in the composition. The real strength of the painting lies in the mountain and the trees on the right, which are depicted as masses of continuous color, which gives them the necessary strength to remain anchored in the picture. In spite of its shortcomings, the painting possesses an emotional value because it transmits a deeply felt personal experience. It is also representative of Emily Carr's style in the years 1912 and 1913 after her return from France. A further step in the process of artistic maturation brings us to Big Raven, the one below. It's an oil on canvas dated 1931, so that's almost 10 years later. 20. The elements of the composition are very similar to the watercolors, but the progress achieved is outstanding. The influence of painter Lauren Harris is obvious in the drawing of the clouds and the vegetation surrounding the pose. Nevertheless, Emily Carr manages to express style of her own in the important elements of the scene. The majesty of the carved raven, in spite of its deteriorated state, the imposing but balanced presence of the totem, notwithstanding the insufficient length of the post it stands on, and the force of nature. On 15 February 1931, Emily describes this painting and what it purports to express in her diary. Got the Kamsheba big bird well disposed on canvas, the great bird on a post in tangled growth, a distant mountain below, and a lowering heavy sky and one pine tree. I want to bring great loneliness to this canvas and a haunted moodiness, quiet and powerful. In June 1928, Emily Carr set out on a long journey. Among other places, she hoped to travel back to the forsaken villages in Queen Charlotte Islands she had visited in 1912. Unfortunately, weather conditions allowed her to land only at Skedans and Kamsheba. The experience of this journey is recollected in Salt Water. The story, by far the longest of the Clearweek stories, makes few concessions to nostalgia, but there is a profound reflection about the growing influence of an alien culture, which natives seem to accept even welcome. But the ensuing decay of First Nations peoples and cultures appears to be the work of an unyielding nature that takes advantage of the social decline to reconquer its primeval territory. A quote from Saltwater. The Indian had never thwarted the growth force springing up so terrifically in them. He had but homed himself there a while, making use of what he needed, leaving the rest as it always was. Civilization crept nearer, and the Indian went to meet it, abandoning his old homes. Then the rush of wild growth swept and gobbled up all that was foreign to it. Rapidly it was obliterating every trace of man. Now only a few hand-hewn cedar planks and roof beams remain, most grown and sagging, a few totem poles rayed in split. The painting Vanquished depicts Skedans as it may have appeared around 1928, when Emily Carr visited it for the second time. Its contemplation may arouse a feeling of nostalgia, increased by that veil of timelessness that seems to cover the scene, hiding the gradual exploitation of natural resources. It is representative of a process of change. The composition includes elements of the past, of a life that seems gone forever. But it also points to a less superficial vision, to the desire to master rhythm and direction. The force of the painting lies in the rolling vegetation at the center of the composition, which rapidly moves and links with the hills on the right. On this soft, deep foundation, scattered and strangely tipped, different types of poles can be seen, like tree trunks badly felled. In the background on the left, a few totem poles are schematically depicted. Behind them, there is a building half swallowed by the poles. It is an old house, but in the painting it looks like a prehistoric monument. The presence of the hills and the mountain on the right is worth noticing as well. This mountainous massage, which in Vanquished shared the space with other compositional elements, will gradually grow independent to become the sole motive in her later paintings. This is the case in The Mountain, or Houses Below the Mountain, both dated 1933. In June 1929, the McGillius supplement published the article Modern and Indian Art of the West Coast by Emily Carr. The text is a reflection on her artistic ideology, and it offers another perspective of the way this Canadian artist viewed memory and the role it plays in the construction of collective history. Her article ends with a reminiscence of her 1928 trip, which may provide a conclusion for this paper. Quote, "The old places and the old people are passing away rapidly. Last year I went north again, the first time for several years. Few poles are left, few old-type houses, and very few old people. Yet the spirit of the Indian still haunts the old spots. What we are trying to remember, they are trying to forget. The young people are fast absorbing the white man's ways, and are half ashamed of these things now. But by and by, when the white race has absorbed them, something deep down within them must surely respond to the great art of their past." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your questions or observations, please. No questions?